Today, I got you a discovery so shocking it might reveal how humans reached an area of the world much earlier than scientists claim. The reason why you and I may have never heard of the archaeological site Hueyatlaco in Mexico might be because, as YouTubers Michael Button and Will claim, it was buried by archaeology. But is it true? Did corrupt scientists really hide monumental findings from us? Or could Michael Button and Will be twisted narratives? What I discovered is not just shocking, it is extremely revealing and concerning. Michael starts by telling us that the story begins in 1959, when a local archaeologist, Juan Armenta Camacho, was exploring the ancient lake beds of the Valsequillo Basin in Mexico. That's true. 1959, Juan Armenta Camacho, an amateur and self-taught archaeologist, yeah, he was a badass, he found these precious bones. It happened while digging in Puebla, Mexico. Michael continues, saying that the bones appear to have deliberate markings and cuts made while the bones were still fresh. Yes, according to records, that's very true. The bones appear to have mysterious carvings. I mean, look at these beauties. Camacho thought they looked like animals. The question was, what kind of animals? And from which era? Well, Michael gives us a clue. He goes on to say that because the bones were already fossilized, they had to be many thousands of years old, suggesting Ice Age people had lived in central Mexico far earlier than mainstream theory allowed. But according to scientific and legitimate records, that's not very true. The truth is actually way more exciting and wild. Scientists explain that fossilized bones do not automatically suggest Ice Age. Not at all. Fossilization is pretty much when bones, even plants and other living things, are buried in the ground. Under the right conditions, which include being under sediment, they can slowly turn to stone. That's because minerals from the soil fill it in. Scientists call this stage mineralization. It's like nature's Medusa, but it happens very slowly. However, scientists explain that fossilization doesn't equal Ice Age. That's because it is not a precise clock. It's a transformation. Bones can reach fossilization in a few thousand years to millions of years. In other words, Camacho's bones may actually be much younger or way older than the Ice Age. That's insane because, imagine decently advanced humans roaming the Americas before the Ice Age. Now, I'm not sure why Michael and Will didn't really dig into this. Maybe the issue, at least with Michael Button, is not that he's lying on purpose, but the fact that he references Wikipedia throughout his entire video. Yes, Wikipedia. If you went to school in the Americas, North, South, Central, you know it is not considered a legitimate source of information. And that's simply because anyone can write and edit Wikipedia pages. They teach this thing to kids in first grade. The chances of getting straight up fake information there are pretty high. But maybe Wikipedia is not entirely wrong this time. We're gonna give it the benefit of the doubt. Another super important point is that neither of them are archaeologists, and that is a very big deal as we move forward through the rest of the story. So Michael Button claims to have a background in ancient history, and then you have William Brown, who claims to have been a history teacher. Those are great and very awesome, but neither one of those degrees come close to archaeology, because an archaeologist is a scientist who's not just great at excavating, extracting information in very scientific ways, but an archaeologist is most likely also a geologist, a chemist, an environmental scientist, a series of things that have to do with sciences. History and ancient history are more like, think of like a philosophy class, a humanities class. They read about things and think about why humans did what they did at certain periods in history, but they are not doing so in scientific ways. And the reason why I mentioned that is not to be a punk with Michael and William. but because that is key and you're gonna notice it as we move forward through the rest of the story. There's a story that they tell, Michael and William, versus the story that scientists tell. And so the story continues. Camacho el Macho was curious. He just wanted other scientists to help him out to test his discovery's age. Fortunately, scientists back then had a fairly new method from the 1940s that could potentially help them figure out how old Camacho's mysterious bones really were. That method is called radiocarbon dating. This is a method that we still use today. It works because all living things have a tiny bit of a special kind of carbon inside them called carbon-14. We carry it because while something is alive, it keeps taking in carbon from air, food, or water. When it dies, it stops taking in new carbon and the carbon-14 inside slowly disappears over time. Clever scientists figure out that by measuring how much carbon-14 is in dead organisms, they can tell about how long ago the animal died, usually up to 50,000 years, according to scientists. But there was a huge problem. Hell yeah, it was a huge problem.
The problem was dating. The bones were so fossilized, their organic materials had been replaced by minerals, preventing C14 from being used on these bones.
Camacho's newly found bones were already fossilized, fully mineralized. Remember the whole thing about Medusa stone thing? That means there was no carbon left to measure. The carbon test would not work. Michael Button tells us that by the early 1960s, the area of Hueyatlaco became the center of a joint Mexican-US research. Indeed, according to records, after Camacho realized that radiocarbon dating would not work on the bones he had, he invited a crew of brilliant minds. He wanted them to test the artifacts to confirm or disprove whether they were from the Ice Age or younger or older. Dr. Hannah Marie Wormington was one of the first ones to arrive. Rest in peace. She was a highly respected American archaeologist and an expert in Ice Age matters. This superstar arrives to Puebla in Mexico. This is by the end of 1959 and into 1960. She takes a look at the bones and the data they already had on it, and dude, it got real. So real. I need some rice and beans to keep up with what's coming up. A little spicy sauce too, because it's gonna get lit with these bones. Dr. Hannah Marie Wormington analyzed microscopic studies that suggested these bones had been carved while the bones were still fresh. This would prove the carvings were not a hoax. It wasn't like a troll grabbed old bones from the Ice Age, but carved them in the 1950s. Or at least, that's what the scientists thought. But what comes next is what changes everything about this story. Dr. Hannah also looked into paleontologist data. Now, just in case you don't know, a paleontologist is a scientist who digs up old bones and fossils to learn about animals and plants that lived long ago. They're basically obsessed with the messages the dead leave behind. This data suggested that the animal who once used those bones to walk around was a freaking mastodon. The mastodon is a giant, cozy-looking but rebellious cousin of the elephant. And the most important thing is that, as of today, scientists claim the mastodon lived during the Ice Age. Isn't that exciting? Dr. Hannah became convinced that Juan Armenta Camacho's discovery was extremely important and very possibly from the Ice Age, potentially the oldest work of art found in the Americas. But was it? Unfortunately, as actual records have it, Dr. Hannah had to leave Puebla because the girl had other businesses to run. But she didn't leave without sharing this potentially groundbreaking discovery. As a matter of fact, Nosy journalists like me picked up on it, and it was published in Life magazine. It was later featured in an article in National Geographic. Camacho's name and career got serious attention, and so did Hueyatlaco, Puebla. There was one more massive thing Dr. Hanna did before she left. She left behind a very promising student of hers. This new archaeologist was about to take the Valsequillo area at Puebla to the next level. Let me proudly introduce you to Cynthia Irwin-Williams. This young archaeologist had been mentored by Dr. Hanna herself, and she had just been hooked up with this already famous archaeological site. YouTubers Will and Michael Button tell us Irwin-Williams and Camacho began systematic excavations. That's very true. But what the heck is systematic excavations? Systematic excavations just means digging carefully in a more scientific way, layer by layer, and in order so that nothing gets lost or mixed up. Before that, Camacho and Macho had worked more like a local fossil hunter, exploring freely, not yet using this formal layer-by-layer method. YouTuber Michael Button says that beneath a layer of volcanic ash, the team uncovered stone tools lying alongside the fossilized remains of extinct Ice Age animals. Is that true? Yes. According to Camacho's report, underneath this very important layer of ash, they found these really cool, sharpened, and carved-looking tools. They also found animal fossils from mammoths and horses, camels, mastodons, and some type of weird ancient dogs and other species, all from the Pleistocene age, which is what scientists call the Ice Age.
So they started excavating down below, and then all of a sudden they started getting these very interesting flint artifacts. And these are projectile points that are unifacial. In other words, actually they're not even bifacial. They're just pieces of flint that have been shaped to a sharp point with these steep flakes coming all the way down here, all the way down there, and that's all they can do to make the artifact. And these were found with mammoth bones, with camels, with horse, all kinds of animals that are now extinct.
Michael also shares the fact that in Camacho's report, he claims Cynthia Irwin-Williams described Hueyatlaco, here in Puebla, as a potential prehistoric kill site. It seemed to her that the Ice Age people used this area as a hunting ground, some type of ancient supermarket for fancy meats and a variety of resources. YouTuber Michael Button brings us to the next big challenge for Camacho's and Williams' team. He says, from the start, dating the site proved treacherous. The bones were fully mineralized, making radiocarbon dating impossible. Hell yeah. That's so correct. As you and I already know, that actually happened according to records. So to figure out this puzzle, the team brought the dawn of geology back then, Harold E. Malde, an American superstar in the scientific world. Michael Button takes the lead again. And he tells us, using stratigraphic comparisons, geologist Hal Malde estimated that the overlying volcanic ash was roughly 22,000 years old, implying that the artifacts beneath it were even older. Is that true? Yes, according to records. However, it is super important to clarify that the 22,000-year estimate was a very rough estimate. To understand why, we need to know what the heck is stratigraphic comparison. In archaeology, it means comparing those layers from one place to the layers at another place. Each one of those layers is like a page in Earth's history book. The deeper you go, the older the layer usually is. According to records, that's what geologist Harold Malde did. Considering that the new findings at Hueyatlaco had no carbon to be tested, Hal decided to find an area a few miles away from Hueyatlaco, but similar enough to do some testing. And by similar, I mean in terms of these layers.
Hal Malde, the geologist, found about 3 or 4 miles away stratigraphy in a deep wash called Colopan. He found some stratigraphy or a layer of soil that he thought was of the same age and of the same nature as the materials they were digging out at the reservoir. Found was a flake that may have been a scraper, some shell, and some organic materials in the soils.
Using the carbon-14 dating method on the shell from Colopan, a date of 22,000 years was derived.
The 22,000-year date was not just super controversial, but a career killer. That's because in the 1960s, most scientists believed the Clovis first theory, which claimed that humans reached the Americas 13,000 years ago. But there's an even bigger problem. How Malde's dating method was super clever for the 1960s. If you can't find carbon here to test it, why not find it in a very similar area, miles away, with carbon and test it? But that method was not strong enough then, and especially not today. That's because matching layers of dirt and ash miles apart is risky business. It's like eating sushi on a Monday. Who knows what the heck you're gonna get? Volcanic ash and lake beds can look very similar even to seasoned geologists, but they might have formed at totally different times. Earth is always changing. Today, archaeologists and geologists need several independent tests from the same exact layer before they can trust the results. When the 22,000-year dating of these discoveries was announced, beef knocked on the door of archaeologists Juan Camacho and Cynthia Williams.
Dr. Jose Luis Lorenzo, head archaeologist at Mexico's National Museum, published a bulletin accusing Irwin-Williams of planting her discoveries.
Of course, Juan Camacho and Cynthia Williams denied hoax in the scientific community. To other scientists, it also didn't seem to be the case.
I don't think she was directly accused of planting the artifacts herself. Instead, it may have been something much worse, that she was incompetent to realize that artifacts were being planted on her site. This goes back to the logistics of planting. These sites were all very hard sediments. They were not dirt like you usually see archaeologists digging in your science films. This was almost like paleontology or geology in the sense that the material, if it wasn't rock, it was almost rock. They had to use picks and chisels rather than the trowel, which is the standard archaeological tool. Consider a sidewalk, and you're trying to tell an archaeologist, or you're trying to convince an archaeologist that something in that sidewalk has been planted. This means you got to break open that sidewalk and try and cover it up, and so that the archaeologist believes that what they're coming upon is something that hasn't seen the light of day for as long as it's been buried. Having worked down there last year and experienced the density and the hardness of the sediments, both the Mexican archaeologists and myself agreed there's just no way you could plant artifacts in this material and hope to get away with it.
Others wondered if Lorenzo was perhaps being an insecure little boy.
I think was a little jealous that, one, he didn't find that early stuff, two, that it was an American that found it, and three, it was an American woman that found it. And so he did everything he could to discredit Cynthia and the work.
We come back to YouTubers Will and Michael Button because they both make very specific claims about what happens next. In Michael Button's words, within a few years, he says, Mexican authorities suspended the excavations entirely, and the Hueyatlaco project fell into limbo. However, I checked scientific journals, studies, and publications about this case, including Juan Camacho's and Cynthia Irwin's reports, and there is no legitimate record of Mexican authorities suspending the excavations. The only places you find those claims are in random blogs by random people. YouTuber Michael Button goes on to say that this supposed suspension, which again is nowhere in actual records to be found, happened soon after Mexican authorities seized Camacho's entire artifact collection and barred him from field work.
Juan Armenta was forbidden to return to the site, and all his artifacts were confiscated.
But nowhere in legitimate records of this incident does it say that authorities took Camacho's artifacts, and at no point were he or his collaborators barred from fieldwork. As a matter of fact, the researchers went back. Obviously, that doesn't disprove that they weren't originally banned, but again, they went back. YouTuber Michael Button goes on to say that whether that is true or not, the outcome is clear, he says. The excavations were shut down, evidence was seized, and the researchers were forced to abandon the site. But again, that is nowhere to be found on any legitimate study or report of this event. None of it. It really doesn't seem like it happened, but it may have. However, there is a much, much darker claim that Michael Button, Will, and the supposed daughter of Juan Armenta Camacho make.
The scientific authorities sent some men with pistols to try to scare the workers at the field. And there were about 60 workers. But 3 of them accepted that the fossils were planted. And only these 3 people who signed the paper and saying, yes, we planted, and the scientists planted the fossils. The other 50 and more workers never accepted. They were very honest.
YouTuber Will from the channel Incredible History even says,
the cover-up at Hueyatlaco is a proven cover-up. Like, they got caught doing it. Men with guns showed up to the site and forced archaeologists, geologists to abandon the project.
I absolutely searched through official records by Camacho, Williams, and other scientists involved during the time, including Virginia's Steen-McIntyre. She was a geologist involved in Hueyatlaco in the 60s, but nothing. The records point toward a very different version of the story. But indeed, discoveries did disappear. Just not as told by these friends. I must tell you about it later because that's another major twist. What records do show is that the excavations at Hueyatlaco were indeed paused, and they did not resume for extended periods. But it seems it was more as a result of professional disagreements and unresolved scientific questions. Not specifically because of guns, banning, and straight-up evil suppression, which may have been, but it's nowhere to be found in legitimate records. But how about the rest of the story YouTubers Michael Button and Will tell us about Hueyatlaco? I had to give him the benefit of the doubt, because if what they tell us next is true, then this story is about to reach boss level. And the discoveries, as I mentioned before, are about to get much, much older than the Ice Age. YouTuber Michael Button shares that geologist Virginia Steen-McIntyre arrived to Hueyatlaco in 1973 with her team, and they returned shocking results using a variety of methods. Those methods included uranium series dating on the bones discovered. The result, according to Michael, was 260,000 years old. That's pretty wild. But is that true? Now, to understand how solid or weak this test is, we first need to understand what it even is. Uranium dating is possible because the ground naturally has uranium. When something like a bone gets buried in the ground, water from the soil slowly carries tiny bits of uranium into it. The uranium sticks inside the bone, kind of like how a sponge soaks up water. After that, the uranium inside the bones starts to change, very slowly, into another element called thorium. Scientists can measure how much uranium is left and how much thorium has formed. Then they use those amounts to guess how long ago the bone was buried. But it's tricky, because the bone isn't closed forever. It has pores. It's open like a sponge. Water can bring in new uranium or wash some away later. That can make the age of the bone look older or younger than it really is. Scientists explain that uranium dating gives a clue, but not always a perfect answer. If the bones were indeed 250,000 years old, it would rewrite the story of the first Americans. It would place humans here long before the Ice Age, much earlier than any accepted model model of humans in the Americas. More testing had to be done. And they did. YouTuber Michael Button tells us that zircon fission track dating on crystals from the volcanic ash above the artifacts indicated ages between about 260,000 to 370,000 years. Is that true? Did this new test really just match the much older than the Ice Age dating? To get an answer, we first need to know what the heck is even zircon fission track dating, because without it, then we won't know how solid those claims really are. Zircon fission track dating is when scientists look at tiny crystals called zircon that were made in volcanoes. Inside each crystal, little bits of uranium atoms split apart. Their protons and neutrons break up inside the crystal. When they break up, the flying particles leave tiny scratches, also known as tracks. It actually takes a long time to happen. The older the crystal, the more tracks it has, kind of like wrinkles in our face. By counting the tracks, scientists can tell how long ago the volcanic rock formed.
My ages came out on two different samples of about 400,000 years and about 600,000 years. These ages had very large errors, which means they could have been anywhere between probably 200,000 and 800,000. They could not have been 10,000 or 15,000. There was just too much antiquity in the grains to allow them to be that young.
However, what they dated with this method wasn't the bones or the tools discovered by the archaeologists at Hueyatlaco. It was the volcanic ash above the artifacts. Remember, that's where they got the zircons from. This is the same layer that buried Cynthia's discoveries. And here's the catch. Even though this method sounds like pure science magic, it's not a perfect clock either. Fission track dating is super sensitive. Heat, pressure, or even water moving through the ground can reset or blur those tiny wrinkles inside the crystal. It can tell us when volcanic ash cooled, but not when humans dropped their tools. That's why scientists treat it like one piece of a puzzle, which is why, as you already know, this wasn't the first nor the last test. Now, the next big question is, will the next test match the 200,000-year-old timeline? YouTuber Michael Button says that tephra hydration and mineral weathering analysis likewise supported an age of well over 200,000 years. Of course I checked that for you, and according to the actual scientists who were there at Hueyatlaco, that is not true at all. The test never ever showed over 200,000 years. What they found was something entirely different. The mineral weathering test, which is where they look at how much a crystal called hypersthene had worn down, showed the ash is definitely older than 24,000 years, and probably much older than that. But it did not give an exact number like 200,000 years. And the tephra hydration test, which is where they check how much water tiny glass pieces soaked up, couldn't give any real number at all because the glass was too tricky to measure. YouTuber Michael Button goes on to say that every method applied by different specialists converge on the same startling conclusion. The Hueyatlaco layers, and thus the tools buried within them, were roughly 250,000 years old. Well, as you now know, those claims are not in alignment at all with what the actual scientists who were there, who investigated, who wrote reports and full-blown scientific papers claim. But how about what he claims is the next phase of this mystery? YouTuber Michael Button goes on to say that Dr. Michael Waters, a respected geoarchaeologist, later examined the site himself and proposed a more conservative explanation. He argued that the stratigraphy could have been altered by ancient flooding or erosion, potentially moving younger tools into older deposits. Yet, multiple geologists, he says, including the original team members, disagree disagreed, insisting the layers were intact and undisturbed. Is this true? According to records, make your bets. It is! That's how things went down according to the scientists involved.
We were able to identify that this was more than likely what she called bed I. And this is again where she claimed to get the unifacial artifacts from. And bed I comes like this, okay, and extends across in this direction, pinches out in this direction, just like many geological units do. But it's also overlain by kind of a silty sand deposit, which then is overlain by this vertisol, which is also overlain by the Hueyatlaco ash. So very clearly on stratigraphic grounds, we can say that bed I is definitely underneath the Hueyatlaco ash. But one thing that we did discover, and it was pointed out by Cynthia Irwin-Williams, was that there was an erosional contact which separated what she called the unifacial material from the bifacial material, okay, as she reported it. And we very clearly found that erosional contact, just like she had reported, and that erosional contact comes up in this direction, and cross cuts and cuts across the older vertisol, indicating that this is a much younger unit, unrelated and younger than the Hueyatlaco ash.
Yet, multiple geologists disagreed.
There is no question in my mind from a geological point of view that the zone that contains the artifacts was not incised by a more recent stream. And to do this, to prove it to ourselves, we have traced that zone from underneath the overlying tuff bed, which is a very good identifying marker, all the way back around the front of the area that's being benched right now, up to a trench that goes back underneath it, and we've followed this bed the entire way, and it is not interrupted, not incised by anything. Therefore, the strata that contain the bifacial tools and together with the bones has not been disturbed at all. The important point here is that the section that we examined is the section in which the fossils were found. It was not eroded, it was not redeposited. Those samples are right, those tools and everything else are right where they started.
Considering what YouTubers Will and Michael Button go on to claim in the next part of the story is loaded with, unfortunately, a lot of misinformation, not sure if on purpose or by mistake. Hey, I myself make mistakes all the time, so I'm not gonna judge them. Let me just tell you what the records show happens next, because it is twisted and the drama never ends. As you already know, the crew at Hueyatlaco studied the volcanic ash layers and the tiny crystals called zircons that were buried around and above the place where Cynthia found her spear points.
We gathered a couple of 100 pounds of that material, and the Mexicans shipped that material up to Stanford University. And at Stanford there was a man named Trevor Dimitru who agreed to reduce all these bags of material down to items which are datable. Half of the material that he reduced was sent to a man who is now at the University of Idaho, who is an expert in fission tracking.
In a zircon crystal, we can calculate the age of an eruption event if that zircon crystal occurs, for example, in a volcanic rock. The fission track dating technique concerns itself only with uranium inside that zircon, which is trapped at the time of crystallization, okay? And it looks at the uranium and the formation of these fission tracks due to the spontaneous atomic splitting or nuclear fission of the U-238 isotope. And those fission tracks form all the time, whether that crystal is in the magma and hot or at the surface and cold, okay? If that crystal is at the surface and cold, that crystal will accumulate fission tracks. They won't disappear due to heating. They'll just constantly add up through time. So the clock is the fission tracks accumulating. The ages that I have for this volcanic layer tell me that these rocks cannot be younger than about 250,000 years. My ages are minimum ages, not maximum ages.
The other half went to Caltech, to a man named Ken Farley, who is the originator and the expert on another dating system used in geology called uranium, thorium, helium dating.
Uranium, thorium, helium dating is a very old idea. It goes back to the discovery of the alpha particle, the first particle discovered to be a radioactive product. It's based on the idea that when uranium decays, it produces alpha particles at a known rate, and by measuring the amount of alpha particles that are present in a crystal, one can establish how long it's been since the helium began to accumulate in that crystal. I was sent zircon separates, which I analyzed here in my lab. The analysis involves picking out a few crystals from the population of crystals I was sent, heating these crystals to 1300 degrees C with a laser or with a resistance furnace. The helium comes out of the crystals at that temperature by diffusion. We then retrieve the crystals from the vacuum furnace after the helium is analyzed, retrieve them from the furnace, dissolve them, and analyze them for uranium and thorium by inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry. Analyzed the samples, produced an age which was between 400 and 500,000 years, and that is slightly older than the age that was obtained by Ray Donelick by the fission track method. And I think within the uncertainties of these measurements, that's probably not a big surprise. In particular, the fission track method has relatively limited resolution at young ages. So the ages are somewhat different, but I don't think they are different beyond a reasonable analytical error.
You now know that these layers work like nature's clocks because they can help experts tell how old the ground is. One of those experts was a scientist named Sam van Landegem. He looked at tiny fossil algae called diatoms. Dude, tell me this doesn't look like geometrical figures shaping reality. Either way, they studied diatoms inside those same sediments where Cynthia found those controversial tools. Well, they found the same kinds of diatoms above and below the tools. The thing is, those diatoms are much, much older than the Ice Age. Some diatoms give an estimated age between 80,000 and 430,000 years. Now, before you get overexcited like me in this moment, I must tell you that test was not perfect, because Sam van Landegem also found younger, still living diatoms, as in diatoms that are still living with us, still exist today, and they were there mixed in, which makes things messy. That's because it suggests the layers were disturbed or reworked by, most likely, of course, natural events. This would actually support the hypothesis that these layers in this area got mixed up, old and new, new and old. Kind of like a nightclub in Miami. For that reason, the diatoms could not establish a precise age. Diatoms also only give a minimum age. So yes, the geology in the area is old, very old actually, but none of these tests can tell us the exact moment humans made these tools. Of course, this story gives us yet another twist, and perhaps this is where it actually gets dark. According to scientists involved at Hueyatlaco, who spoke in this documentary, Cynthia Irwin-Williams finished her work in Puebla. I estimate it happened around 1966. She returned all her bone and tool discoveries over to Mexico's National Museum, the Museo Nacional de Antropología, which, if you haven't been, my God, please do. It's stunning. But back to Cynthia, she returned her things because that's exactly what the law required, and still does. When she goes back to study them, I don't know if it's months or years later, they're not specific about it, well, her items, her discoveries were simply gone. I am not insinuating like a conspiracy theorist that they were taken and locked up, but these scientists say that they went missing. And if those scientists are not lying, well, they're still missing as of today. With no artifacts, I mean, you can assume the mystery of Hueyatlaco stayed stuck like a book missing its pages. It's like a story that no one can finish writing. The truth, according to legitimate records, which include Camacho's reports, Williams' reports, McIntyre's reports, and a bunch of other documents, the truth is, according to them, that Hueyatlaco wasn't buried by jealous men with guns. It was a lot more complex than that. It was buried under uncertainty, lack of advanced and precise methods, and scientific disagreements. It seemed the true story is that they were staring at a mystery that science just wasn't ready to solve yet. That's not evidence of a cover-up, especially not archaeologists' biggest cover-up. That's science doing its job. But I'm not denying other forces may have been at play. I mean, how could I know? I wasn't there. You let me know what you think, but the biggest lesson for me today was that the next time I hear some person online claiming to have forbidden information that everyone missed, but somehow they have, I'm gonna be very skeptic. I'm gonna think about it 100 times before I trust this person. Thank you so much for existing. I can't wait to see you soon.